You could drop the world's strongest athlete into the Ice Age right now. Olympic gold medalist, Navy SEAL, extreme survivalist, doesn't matter, and they'd be dead within days. Not from the cold, though that would certainly help. Not from a saber-toothed cat, though those were definitely around. They'd die from something so basic, so fundamental, that it's almost embarrassing. Thirst. Surrounded by ice. Literally millions of tons of frozen water in every direction, and they'd die of dehydration before they even realized what was killing them. Because the Ice Age wasn't just about being tough. It wasn't about wrestling mammoths or enduring blizzards. It was about possessing a kind of knowledge so fundamental, so integrated into daily existence, that losing it means death, fast. Here's what would happen to you in the first few hours. You'd see ice everywhere, a frozen landscape that looks like an infinite source of water. Your modern brain would think, I'm thirsty, there's frozen water, I'll just eat some snow. And with that simple, logical decision, you'd have just signed your death warrant. Eating snow is one of the fastest ways to die in a cold environment. Every gram of snow you put in your mouth steals precious body heat to melt it. The return is pathetic. You'd need to eat enormous amounts of snow to get enough water, and each mouthful drops your core temperature. You're literally trading life-sustaining warmth for a few drops of liquid. Ice Age humans knew this. Every child knew this. It was probably one of the first lessons learned. Snow is not water. But let's say you figure that out. You resist the urge to eat snow. Now you face the second trap, cold-induced diuresis. Your body, when exposed to cold, does something counterintuitive and potentially lethal. It starts dumping water through increased urination. The cold causes blood vessels in your extremities to constrict, pushing blood to your core. You're losing water faster in the cold, not slower. And here's the killer detail. Cold also suppresses thirst. You won't even feel thirsty until you're dangerously dehydrated. Modern Arctic explorers know this. They force themselves to drink on a schedule because waiting until you feel thirsty means you're already in trouble. But you, dropped into the Ice Age without this knowledge, would miss all the signals. You'd be stumbling, confused, and weak before realizing that surrounded by frozen water, you're dying of thirst. So how did Ice Age humans solve this? Fire. Always fire. They melted snow and ice in containers, animal bladders, tightly woven baskets sealed with pine pitch, or heated stones dropped into water-filled hide bags. But this required planning. You needed fuel, and in the Ice Age tundra, wood was scarce. They burned animal bones, dried dung, and carefully hoarded every scrap of burnable material. One site in Ukraine, dated to the last glacial maximum, shows hearths where humans burned primarily bone and animal fat. They had different fire designs for different purposes. High heat for cooking, slow burns for warmth, specific configurations for melting ice efficiently. The archaeological record at Cormandanain shows something remarkable. These weren't desperate people barely surviving. They were fire management experts. They understood combustion at a practical level that most modern humans never achieve. They could read the color of flames, the smell of smoke, the behavior of different fuels. They knew which bones burned longest, which produced the most heat, which created the least smoke for inside a shelter. You might manage to start a fire if you're lucky. Maybe. But maintaining it through an Ice Age night, rationing fuel, maximizing heat while minimizing smoke in your shelter, using it efficiently to melt water without wasting precious calories gathering more fuel. That's a skill set that took generations to perfect. And without it, dehydration would claim you long before the cold ever could. But water is just the beginning. Let's say by some miracle, you solve the water problem. You figured out fire, you're melting ice, you're staying hydrated. Now you face a challenge that would break even elite athletes, the calorie cliff. Modern polar explorers consume between 6,000 and 8,000 calories per day. That's 3 to 4 times a normal diet. In one documented Arctic expedition, team members ate 8,000 calories daily and still lost weight. The cold forces your body to burn incredible amounts of energy just to maintain core temperature. Add in the physical exertion of survival, gathering fuel, hunting, building shelter, and the caloric demands become astronomical. But here's where it gets worse. It's not just about quantity, it's about the type of calories. You could eat lean meat all day and still die. There's a condition called rabbit starvation, or protein poisoning. Your body can only process so much protein. Without adequate fat, you'll develop nausea, diarrhea, and eventually death, even while eating plenty of food. Ice Age humans knew this intimately. Chemical analysis of butchered bones from Paleolithic sites shows they weren't just eating meat. They were specifically targeting fat-rich parts of animals. They cracked bones for marrow. They boiled bones for hours to extract every bit of grease. They specifically hunted animals in fall when fat reserves were highest. They ate organs, especially fat-rich organs like brain and liver. They even developed techniques for rendering and storing fat. Archaeological evidence shows traces of what might be pemmican-like preparations, where fat was mixed with dried meat for preservation. Your modern digestive system, adapted to a carbohydrate-rich diet, would rebel against this. Imagine eating spoonfuls of pure animal fat as a significant portion of your daily calories. Not meat with some fat on it, actual rendered fat, like eating soft butter by itself. Your stomach would turn. You'd likely vomit. Even if you could keep it down, your gut microbiome, used to processing grains and vegetables and fruits, would struggle to adapt quickly enough. Surrounded by game animals, you could successfully hunt, successfully kill, eat plenty of meat, and still die of malnutrition because you couldn't stomach the fat content necessary for survival. Those 8,000 calories? In the Ice Age, that meant consuming perhaps a pound or more of pure animal fat per day, in addition to meat and whatever plant foods you could find. And finding those calories required skills that read like fantasy to modern humans. Ice Age hunters at sites like Roche de Solutré in France show evidence of cooperative hunting on a massive scale. They understood migration patterns so well, they could predict exactly where herds would pass. They built fire lines to drive entire herds of horses or reindeer into natural traps, canyon dead ends where animals could be killed efficiently in large numbers. This wasn't opportunistic hunting. This was industrial-scale food procurement that required precise timing, detailed environmental knowledge, and coordination between multiple bands of humans. They knew which wind directions would carry smoke to panic animals in the right direction. They knew exactly how each species would react to different threats. They could read the landscape like a book, seeing natural funnel points and kill zones where we would see only hills and valleys. One fascinating detail from the archaeological record: at many kill sites, we find evidence of selective butchering. They weren't taking everything. They were specifically choosing the fattiest cuts, leaving lean meat behind. When you're burning 8,000 calories a day, you can't afford to waste stomach space on lean protein. Every bite had to count. You, with your modern sensibilities and carb-adapted metabolism, would make all the wrong choices. You'd go for what looks like good meat, the lean red muscle tissue we prize today. You'd avoid the greasy, yellowish fat that Ice Age humans prized above all else. And that cultural preference, ingrained so deeply you don't even think about it, would kill you as surely as any predator. Speaking of predators, we need to talk about something modern humans have completely forgotten: what it feels like to be prey. In Ice Age Eurasia, you'd share the landscape with cave lions, larger than modern lions, and, according to isotope analysis of their bones, specializing in hunting reindeer and horses, and occasionally humans. Cave hyenas, significantly larger than their modern cousins, hunted in coordinated packs. Isotope studies of their bones show they weren't just scavengers. They were active predators, capable of taking down large prey. There's a 1.8 million-year-old hominin skull with puncture marks perfectly matching the canine teeth of a large cat. We have direct fossil evidence that our ancestors were prey, and not ancient distant ancestors. Anatomically modern humans from the Ice Age show occasional evidence of carnivore damage on their bones. But it wasn't just the massive predators. Wolves in the Pleistocene traveled in larger packs than today. Dholes, Asian wild dogs, hunted in coordinated groups that could bring down prey many times their size. Even wolverines, pound for pound one of the most aggressive predators on Earth, were common across Ice Age territories. Archaeological evidence from multiple sites shows how seriously they took these threats. Sleeping areas and caves were always positioned with clear sight lines to entrances. Multiple hearths were maintained to create overlapping zones of light and smoke. They developed early warning systems, everything from simple noisemakers to potentially using domesticated wolves, the earliest dogs, as sentries. You'd break every rule without knowing rules existed. You'd wander out alone to gather firewood, not understanding that solitary humans were prime targets. You'd let the fire die down at night to conserve fuel, not realizing that the darkness invited death. You'd sleep too deeply, exhausted from the survival efforts, missing the subtle sounds that would have every Ice Age human instantly alert and reaching for weapons. Ice Age humans developed cultural and social structures specifically to manage this psychological burden. They shared watch duties. They told stories that encoded predator behavior into memorable narratives. They created rituals and beliefs that gave meaning to the danger, transforming raw terror into manageable caution. But perhaps the most fundamental challenge is one that seems almost absurdly simple: what every Ice Age teenager knew that modern PhDs don't. An Ice Age 14-year-old possessed practical knowledge that would humble today's survival experts. Not because they were smarter, their brains were identical to ours, but because their education was survival itself, taught from birth in an unforgiving classroom where failure meant death. They could identify dozens of plant species, not just by their leaves or flowers, but by their winter stems poking through snow. They knew which roots remained edible under permafrost, which bark could be eaten in desperation, which lichens were nutritious, and which were toxic. This wasn't book learning. This was deep, practical knowledge encoded through stories, songs, and hands-on experience. They could track animals across frozen ground, reading signs invisible to modern eyes. A slight depression in snow told them not just that an animal passed, but what kind, how long ago, its size, its health, whether it was hunting or being hunted. They could predict weather changes from subtle shifts in wind patterns, cloud formations, and animal behavior. They knew when a blizzard was coming days in advance, reading signs we don't even recognize as signs. The accuracy of animal depictions is so precise that biologists can identify not just species, but seasonal variations. The thickness of a bison's coat in a painting tells us what time of year it was painted. The behavior shown, mating displays, herd formations, hunting postures, encoded crucial survival information into memorable images. These paintings serve the same function as modern educational materials, but with a critical difference. The knowledge they contained was immediately applicable to life or death situations. A young hunter studying these images wasn't learning abstract concepts, but practical intelligence that would be used within days or weeks. Ice Age humans understood their environment with an intimacy we can barely imagine. They knew the personality of every water source, which springs ran year-round, which froze first, where animals came to drink at dawn. They could navigate using subtle landmarks in seemingly featureless tundra. They possessed mental maps of vast territories, passed down through generations, marking resources, dangers, and seasonal variations. This knowledge was social, not individual. It existed in the connections between people, in the stories told around fires, in the accumulated wisdom of generations. An individual's survival depended not just on their own knowledge, but on their integration into this social network of information. The humbling truth is that despite our technological advancement, we've lost more practical knowledge than we've gained. We've traded breadth for depth, specializing in narrow fields while losing the generalist survival knowledge that every Ice Age human took for granted. But all of this, the water, the calories, the predators, the knowledge, all of it becomes irrelevant if you can't do one thing: make and maintain fire. In the Ice Age, fire wasn't just useful, it wasn't just important. It was the absolute dividing line between life and death, and that line was measured in hours, not days. Modern humans dramatically underestimate the complexity of fire management. Starting a fire in Ice Age conditions required profound knowledge. You needed to know which stones could create sparks. Not all flint works equally well. You needed to understand how to prepare tinder in a world where everything was frozen or wet. Ice Age humans carried fire-starting kits that would impress modern survivalists. Dried fungi carefully preserved in waterproof containers, pitch-soaked plant fibers, pyrite nodules selected for their spark-producing qualities. But starting a fire was just the beginning. Maintaining it through an Ice Age night required expertise that took years to develop. Different fires for different purposes. The archaeological record shows this clearly. High oxygen fires for tool production, reaching temperatures needed to heat treat flint. Slow-burning fires for overnight warmth, carefully banked with ash and fed with specific materials to last hours without attention. Smoke-producing fires to preserve meat and hide. Clean-burning fires for inside shelters, using bone and fat combinations that produced heat without choking smoke. The Korman 9 site in Ukraine reveals just how sophisticated this knowledge was. During the last glacial maximum, humans there created hearths with different designs for different seasons. Summer fires were shallow and broad, maximizing cooking surface. Winter fires were deep and narrow, conserving heat and fuel. They understood draft management, building windscreens and reflectors to control airflow and heat distribution. Fuel procurement was its own complex skill set. In treeless tundra, they burned bones, but not just any bones. Long bones with marrow burned differently than flat bones. Fresh bones burned differently than weathered ones. They learned to prepare bones for burning, sometimes treating them with fat, sometimes drying them for weeks. They created composite fuels, mixing different materials to achieve specific burn characteristics. They understood the chemistry of combustion at a practical level. They knew which materials produced toxic smoke, which created the most heat per weight, which burned cleanly enough for enclosed spaces. They could read the color of flames to diagnose problems. Too much moisture, not enough oxygen, improper fuel mixture. You wouldn't last one night. Not because you're weak or stupid, but because you lack years of accumulated practical knowledge. You might manage to start a fire, maybe, but keeping it alive through a 20-hour Arctic night while rationing fuel, creating enough heat to survive without filling your shelter with deadly smoke, managing the delicate balance between conserving precious fuel and maintaining life-saving warmth. So we return to the fundamental question: why did they thrive where we would die? The answer isn't about physical evolution. Ice Age humans weren't tougher, stronger, or more resistant to cold. Their brains weren't different. Their bodies weren't specially adapted. They were, biologically speaking, exactly us. The difference was entirely cultural. They survived because they were embedded in networks of knowledge and mutual support that we can barely imagine. Every skill I've described, the fire management, the hunting strategies, the predator awareness, the botanical knowledge, none of this existed in isolation. It was part of an integrated survival system passed down through generations, refined through millennia of trial and error, and shared across networks of allied bands. Paleoanthropologist Rick Potts argues this was our species' key advantage, not our intelligence. Neanderthals were equally smart. Not our tools. Other humans made sophisticated technology, but our ability to maintain what he calls a sense of social identity across vast networks. We shared information and aid beyond our immediate family groups, using language, symbolism, and ritual to maintain connections across time and distance. This is what you'd lack, dropped into the Ice Age. Not just the skills, but the social context that made those skills meaningful and transmissible. You'd be trying to survive as an individual in a world where survival was fundamentally collective. The archaeological record shows this clearly. Trade goods moved hundreds of miles, shells from distant coasts, specific types of high-quality flint, amber, and other materials that had no survival value but served as social currency. These objects maintained relationships between groups, creating networks of mutual obligation that could be activated in times of crisis. Yes, it encoded practical knowledge, but it also created shared identity. Groups that had never met could recognize common symbols, shared mythologies, similar ritual practices. This cultural commonality allowed strangers to become allies, expanding the safety net far beyond biological kinship. Modern humans have largely forgotten what this kind of interdependence feels like. We imagine survival as an individual challenge, man versus nature. But Ice Age humans understood it as fundamentally social. Nature wasn't conquered by heroes. It was survived by communities. An Ice Age human transported to our time would be amazed by our technology, but horrified by our isolation. They'd wonder how we survive without knowing our neighbors, without extended networks of mutual support, without the deep knowledge of our local environment that comes from generations of accumulated wisdom. They'd be right to wonder. We've created a world where we no longer need the skills that defined humanity for 99% of our existence. But in doing so, we've also created a world where we're fundamentally helpless without our technological infrastructure. We've solved the problems of the Ice Age by creating new forms of vulnerability our ancestors couldn't imagine. Drop a modern human in the Ice Age and watch them die within days, maybe hours. Drop an Ice Age human in the modern world and, well, they'd adapt. Because that's what humans do. That's what we've always done. We survive, we learn, we change. The question is, in our rush to change, what essential parts of humanity have we left behind in the ice?